At just after 1 p.m. on September 20th, 2018, a forensic anthropologist kneeling in a South Australian backyard raised her hand and called for everyone to stop digging. Beneath a slab of concrete behind a garden shed, in a hole barely 2 feet down, she had found bone. 45 years earlier, almost to the week, a 24-year-old mother named Colleen Adams had gone to bed in the house behind that shed and never woken up in it again. For nearly 5 decades, police called it a disappearance. Her own sister called it something else. And the man who told everyone she'd simply walked out on her 2 baby daughters, packed her bags, kissed them goodbye, and vanished with a stranger in a car, had been sleeping 20 minutes down the road the entire time. Free, remarried, watching his daughters grow up believing their mother had abandoned them. He had poured that concrete slab himself, with his own hands, less than 24 hours after killing her. And it would take police 45 years, a cold case review nobody expected to go anywhere, and one doorstep confrontation from a local news crew to finally break him. If you've ever wondered what it actually looks like when a missing person case turns out to have been a murder all along, hiding in plain sight, underneath a family's own backyard, for almost half a century, this is that story. And I promise you, the ending is not what you expect. Before we go further, I want you to sit with something. 2 little girls slept through their mother's murder in the next room. They grew up in that same house. They walked over that same slab of concrete for years, to hang washing, to play, to help their dad in the garden, never knowing what was 6 inches beneath their feet. If a story like that deserves to be remembered accurately, hit subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is the real timeline, corrected and verified. Not the sanitized version their father spent 45 years selling to everyone who'd listen. Turn on notifications too, because we cover cases like this every week, and you won't want to miss where this one ends up. To understand how a murder can hide for 45 years, you have to go back to the very ordinary town where it happened. Maitland is a small farming town on South Australia's York Peninsula, a strip of coastline where everybody knows everybody, where a scandal is still news 3 weeks later, and where, in November 1973, a young couple named Jeffrey and Colleen Adams were living with their 2 daughters on Bagnall Avenue. Colleen was 24 years old. She had been born just up the coast in Wallaroo in 1949, and by the time she was in her mid-20s she had 2 little girls of her own, Marie, 3 years old, and Kay, just 18 months. By every account her family would later give, she loved those girls fiercely. Jeffrey Adams was 25, and on the night of November 22nd, he came home late. He'd been drinking. What happened next, we only know because Jeffrey himself eventually described it. 45 years later, sitting across a table from 2 homicide detectives, finally telling the truth. According to his own account, Colleen was waiting up when he walked in, and an argument started almost immediately. He would later tell police she'd been having a go at him for weeks, that the fighting had built up, that on this particular night it tipped him over some edge. He picked up a metal bar. He struck her across the head. Then he hit her again. She collapsed onto the kitchen floor of their family home. And she did not get up, for people were in that house that night. Jeffrey, standing in the kitchen, Colleen on the floor, and down the hall, in a bedroom, 2 little girls, 3 years old and 18 months old, sound asleep, with absolutely no idea that the last moments of their mother's life were happening on the other side of a thin wall. Jeffrey did not call an ambulance. He did not call a neighbor, a doctor, a relative, or the police. He left his wife's body on the kitchen floor and simply stayed in the house until morning. The same house, the same rooms, his daughters asleep down the hall the entire time. When daylight came, he went into the backyard with a shovel. He dug a hole. It wasn't deep, just deep enough. And when it was ready, he carried his 24-year-old wife's body out to the yard, lowered her into the ground, and covered her over. By the time his daughters woke up that morning, there was no body in the kitchen. There was no blood on the floor. Jeffrey cleaned up, made his girls breakfast, and sat them down to eat it at the very table where, hours earlier, their mother had died. At some point, the exact timing was never established, possibly within hours, possibly weeks. He poured a concrete slab over the patch of disturbed earth in the backyard, behind the garden shed. It hardened into something completely unremarkable. A flat, gray rectangle of concrete that any visitor would walk straight past without a second glance. Even decades later, when detectives finally stood in that same backyard trying to work out where to even begin digging, the slab gave nothing away. It just looked like concrete. And then Jeffrey Adams did the part that would let him get away with it for 45 years. He built a story. The story Jeffrey Adams told the next morning was simple enough to be believed, and specific enough to sound true. He said he'd woken up around 7 a.m. to find Colleen standing at the bedroom door, fully dressed, 2 suitcases packed beside her. He said she told him the marriage was over, that she never wanted to see him or their daughters again. He said he watched her walk out, climb into a car driven by a middle-aged woman he didn't recognize, and disappear down the street. In 1973, in a small conservative country town, a young mother walking out on her husband and 2 toddlers was scandalous. People talked about it, but it wasn't a crime. It was gossip, not an investigation. Jeffrey didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, he added detail after detail, each one making the story a little more airtight and Colleen a little more monstrous. He told people she'd been struggling with postnatal depression. He claimed that on her way out the door, she'd turned to their daughters and called them names, cruel enough that no one who heard it would want to defend her. Piece by piece, he built the picture of a woman broken enough and heartless enough that abandoning 2 toddlers fit exactly who she supposedly was. The lie was never really about where Colleen went. It was about who she was. He needed people to believe she was capable of leaving, so that nobody would ever ask whether she'd been capable of staying forever in the ground behind her own garden shed. Colleen's mother, Vera Milbank, waited 27 days for a phone call, a letter, anything. She kept hoping her daughter would surface somewhere and confirm even part of what Jeffrey had said. Nothing came. On December 19, 1973, Vera walked into a South Australian police station and filed a missing person report. She told officers flatly that her daughter would never have left without a word, that Colleen loved those girls too much. Police drove out to Bagnall Avenue and interviewed Jeffrey. He gave them the same polished story he'd given everyone else. They walked through the house. No blood, no damage. Nothing that suggested violence had ever happened inside those walls, because by then, there was nothing left to find. The case went into the system as exactly what Jeffrey wanted it to look like. A voluntary disappearance, domestic conflict, destination unknown. It would stay filed that way for the next 45 years. Colleen never resurfaced. No call to her sisters, Heather and Christina. No letter to her mother. No contact with a single friend. The bank account she'd shared with Jeffrey sat completely untouched. And in 6 years she made no attempt, not once, to see her own daughters. Heather, 16 when her sister vanished, never stopped saying it out loud. This didn't add up. The Colleen she'd grown up with wasn't capable of walking away from her children and never looking back. But a sister's certainty isn't evidence, and without something concrete to contradict Jeffrey's story, the file stayed exactly where it was. By 1979, 6 full years of silence, the absence of any contact had become its own kind of evidence. No sightings, no word, no trace of a woman who supposedly just wanted to start over somewhere else. South Australia police reclassified Colleen's case as a major crime investigation. Detectives brought Jeffrey in again. He was calm, consistent, cooperative even. 6 years hadn't put a single crack in his story. But the investigators had nothing to actually work with. No body meant no cause of death. No cause of death meant no charge to bring. No witness meant no corroboration. Suspicion doesn't hold up in a courtroom, evidence does. And there was none. The 80s came and went with the case going nowhere. Occasional tips would surface, get followed up, and collapse into nothing. The file moved between detectives, each one inheriting the same dead ends as the last. Jeffrey Adams, meanwhile, was still living on the York Peninsula the entire time. He eventually moved from Maitland to Wallaroo, about 20 minutes away, the very town Colleen had been born in, still raising the 2 daughters whose mother he had killed in their own kitchen. In 2001, acting on a theory that Colleen's remains might have been dumped away from the family home, detectives organized a search of a local rubbish tip. They worked the site for days. They found nothing. Not long after, the South Australian government posted a $200,000 reward for information leading to Colleen's remains or a conviction. Nobody ever claimed it, because the only person who actually knew where Colleen was had already retired quietly into a normal life, 20 minutes up the road from the backyard where she was buried. And in that backyard, under a slab that had been there for decades, two daughters were growing up believing a lie designed specifically to make them ashamed of their own mother. Marie, the older girl, was old enough by then to carry fragments of memory, vague impressions of a house, a mood, nothing solid. Kay had nothing at all. No face, no voice, not a single real memory of Colleen. Everything either of them believed about their mother came from their father, and what their father told them was the exact story he'd invented in November 1973. Marie grew up believing, for most of her life, that her mother had left because of her. That a mother walking out on a 3-year-old and an 18-month-old without ever looking back meant something had been fundamentally wrong with the children she left behind. Kay grew up with an absence where a mother should have been, filled in entirely by her father's version of events. Everyone in Maitland knew the story. Marie grew up known, quite literally, as the daughter of the woman who left. She carried a mother's name, her mother's name, as her own middle name for 50 years without ever knowing who that woman actually was. Heather refused to let it go. She told her nieces, again and again, that their mother had loved them, that she would never have walked away. But Heather had no proof, only conviction. And convictions don't beat the story you're told every single day by the man who raised you. For 45 years, two versions of Colleen Adams existed side by side in the same small town. Only one of them was true, and the truth sat, silently, under a slab of concrete behind a garden shed, while the man who poured it lived free, remarried, and grew old. I want to pause here because this is the part of the story that I think gets lost in true crime content. We focus so much on catching the killer that we forget the quieter tragedy sitting right alongside it. Marie spent 50 years believing she was somehow responsible for her own mother's abandonment. That's not just a cold case. That's a lie that shaped an entire childhood, an entire identity. If stories like this, the ones where the real victims are the people left behind carrying a lie they didn't know they were carrying, hit you the way they hit me, drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these cases properly, with the facts checked and the families treated with the respect they deserve. And if you're new here, subscribe, because Batch 3 is where this case finally starts to crack open. By September 2018, Colleen Adams' file was 45 years old, and South Australia police had a standing process for reviewing unsolved major crime cases. Colleen's was overdue for another look. On September 16, 2018, the Major Crime Investigation Branch pulled the file and started from scratch, reading every statement, every interview, every dead end that had piled up since 1973 as if none of it had happened yet. 2 days later, on September 18th, a team of detectives arrived at the property on Bagnall Avenue. Jeffrey still owned the house. He'd been renting it out for years. Police needed his permission to search it. He gave it calmly, the same way he'd cooperated with every interview for 4.5 decades. This time, they came with ground-penetrating radar and specialist camera equipment. Over 2 days, they scanned the backyard and the interior of the house, section by section. And they found something, what Detective Superintendent Desprez would later call an anomaly, a patch of ground beneath one of the concrete slabs where the soil didn't match anywhere else on the property. Detectives started digging. That first pass turned up nothing, but they kept going. While the search was underway, Detective Michael Newberry spoke to reporters gathered outside the property. "We have an open mind as to what has happened and how it has happened," he said. "But we are of the opinion Colleen has been murdered." That afternoon, Superintendent Bray held a media briefing. He confirmed police had spoken to a suspect and searched the Maitland property, though no remains had yet been found. He told reporters that Colleen's family deserved answers, and that the investigation wouldn't stop until they had them. He never named the suspect out loud. He didn't need to. Anyone who'd followed this case for 45 years already knew exactly whose backyard was being dug up. That same afternoon, a reporter from 9 News Adelaide drove up the peninsula to Wallaroo and knocked on the front door of a 70-year-old man. The footage that resulted is short, almost mundane to look at. An old man in his doorway, a reporter on the path, a camera between them. The reporter asked him directly, whether he had killed his wife. He said no. Flat, immediate, no hesitation. When the reporter told him police had named him as a suspect, he simply shrugged. All husbands are a suspect, he said. He told the camera he believed his wife was probably still alive somewhere, that he hoped she was well. It was the last time Jeffrey Adams would ever tell that lie to anyone. That night, the evening news carried both Bray's press briefing and the doorstep footage back to back. A police superintendent all but confirming a murder investigation, immediately followed by the prime suspect denying it on his own front step. Every person on the York Peninsula who owned a television saw it. The next morning, September 19, 2018, detectives drove back to Wallaroo and sat down with Jeffrey Adams at his own kitchen table. And for the first time in 45 years, he told them what actually happened on the night of November 22, 1973. He said he wanted to come clean, that he'd been carrying it since the morning he buried her, and that it was time. The interview ran for more than 2 hours, recorded on video, and it would later become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. I just struck her a bit hard and that was it, he told detectives. She fell to the floor and then she died. He told them his daughters had always had a suspicion, though he'd never once admitted anything to either of them across 5 decades of raising them. He mentioned that police had come close to finding Colleen once before, 15 years earlier, without elaborating on what he meant by that. Then he told detectives exactly where to look: the backyard of the Maitland house, beneath the concrete slab behind the garden shed. He offered to take them there himself. That afternoon, Jeffrey Adams stood in his old backyard, the same yard where he dug a hole by hand 45 years earlier, and pointed out precisely where his wife was buried. Standing on the slab he had poured with his own hands, he said he was sorry. He was arrested on the spot and charged with murder. He didn't apply for bail. The next morning he appeared by video link at Kadena Magistrates Court and was remanded into custody at Port Pirie Prison. The first night in 45 years that Jeffrey Adams would sleep somewhere other than a free man's bed. Think about the sheer weight of that timeline for a second. A reporter's doorstep question and a police press conference, broadcast on the same night, and within 12 hours a man who had kept a secret for 45 years finally broke. Not because of new forensic technology. Not because of a surprise witness. Because public pressure and a cold case review, working together, finally cracked something that had held for almost half a century. This is exactly why cold cases stay open, why reviews like this matter, and honestly why channels like this one exist, to keep these cases in front of people long after the headlines fade. If you want to see exactly what detectives found when they dug up that backyard, and what happened at trial, stay with me because Batch 4 is where Colleen finally comes home, and where this story takes one more gutting turn nobody saw coming. Smash that like button if you're still with me. It genuinely tells me to keep making these properly researched. Officers from the Major Crime Investigation Branch brought excavation equipment to Bagnall Avenue that same afternoon. They cordoned off the backyard with crime scene tape and erected a tent directly over the slab Jeffrey had identified. Forensic anthropologists worked through the night preparing the site. The dig began at first light on September 20, 2018. The concrete came up first. Then the soil beneath it cleared away in careful, patient layers. Just after 1 p.m., the exact moment we opened this story with, they found her. Skeletal remains, at a depth consistent with a grave hand dug in a single morning back in 1973, buried beneath concrete that had sat undisturbed for 45 years. She was in the area indicated to us, Superintendent Bray told reporters. Discovered about 1 hour ago. Forensic examination confirmed exactly what Jeffrey had described at his kitchen table. The pathologist found multiple fractures to the skull, consistent with repeated blunt force trauma from a heavy metal object. There was also a broken hand, the kind of injury someone sustains raising an arm to block a blow they know is coming. A short time later, Kay arrived at the property. She hadn't set foot there since she was a small child. She'd been 18 months old when her mother was buried in that yard. She was 46 now. Through a victim contact officer, she gave a statement to the media. Today I finally found my mother. After 45 years of hoping, we have found her. She thanked the police who had never let the file close for good. She said she hoped the day would be one of inspiration to anyone else living with an unsolved case in their own family. Today we have seen there is hope. Colleen's remains were taken to Forensic Science SA for formal identification. Jeffrey offered an early plea to manslaughter, an admission that he'd killed his wife, buried her, and lied about it for 45 years, while stopping short of admitting intent to kill. The Crown refused it. Chief Crown Prosecutor Jim Pears pushed the case to trial on a charge of murder. The trial opened in the Supreme Court of South Australia on August 10, 2020, before Justice David Peake. Pears told the jury that 4.5 decades of calculated deception spoke to a man who had acted with clear intent, that Jeffrey had spent 45 years constructing and maintaining a false narrative of a mentally unstable woman who'd abandoned her own children. The concrete slab itself, Pears argued, was evidence in its own right. A man who kills in a single moment of blind rage doesn't calmly return days later to pour concrete over the evidence. The jury watched all 2 hours of Jeffrey's confession video, one recording out of 11 hours of police interviews he gave in custody, and the piece of evidence a magistrate had already described at his committal hearing as the core of the entire case. Jeffrey Adams was 72 by the time the trial opened. He sat in the dock and cried as the footage of his own confession played back to him. He did not take the stand in his own defense. His defense counsel didn't dispute the killing, the burial, or the decades of lying. None of it was in question. What they contested was intent. They argued the blows had happened in the heat of a domestic argument, not as part of a premeditated plan to kill. That Jeffrey may have lashed out, realized immediately what he'd done, panicked, and only then committed to the cover-up that followed. Despicable lying after the fact, the defense argued, still wasn't proof of murderous intent in the moment itself. That, they said, was manslaughter followed by concealment, not murder. On Friday, August 21, 2020, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty of murder, guilty of manslaughter. The Crown had pushed for the higher charge and lost, though manslaughter still carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment in South Australia. At sentencing submissions the following month, Marie gave her victim impact statement to the court. She had been 3 years old when her mother was killed. She was 50 now, and she had carried Colleen as her own middle name through every year of her life without ever truly knowing who her mother was. I believed that I had been responsible for her leaving, she told the court. I thought that I must be unlovable. She described growing up in a small town where everyone knew the story of the mother who supposedly walked out. How it left her feeling rejected, like she never fully belonged anywhere. I felt like I was living with the sins of my mother, she said. And now I realize it was the sins of my father. She told the court the most meaningful thing to come out of the entire ordeal was finally knowing, with certainty, that her mother had loved her, that the version of Colleen she'd spent 50 years being ashamed of had been a lie her own father built and maintained for 45 years. Not only have I lost my mother, she said, but I feel that I have also lost my father. Sentencing was scheduled for late 2020. It never happened. In early December, the court received medical reports from Royal Adelaide Hospital. Jeffrey Adams had been diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, an aggressive, inoperable brain cancer. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Within weeks he was paralyzed down one side, unable to open one eye or move his own arm or leg. Doctors expected he had, at most, weeks left to live. On December 14, 2020, the court convened to address the situation. Jeffrey wasn't present. He was unconscious, in what his own doctors described as a state clearly near death. Sentencing was adjourned to the following April. That date never came. Jeffrey Adams died overnight in his hospital bed at the age of 72. Heather Johncock, Colleen's sister, had the final word. In the end, we got to the bottom of what happened, she said. We got through the trial and he had to tell the truth, and now this is the end of it. The important thing is that we got Colleen back, a 24-year-old mother, buried in a shallow grave for 45 years. 2 daughters raised 20 minutes from where she lay, taught by their own father to be ashamed of a woman who never once stopped loving them. And the man responsible died in custody with a manslaughter conviction on his record, and not a single day of that sentence ever served. The slab behind the garden shed is gone now. But Colleen Adams finally came home. If this case affected you the way it affected putting it together, I genuinely love to hear which part hit hardest. Marie's statement in court, Kay finally saying, "I found my mother." Or that single doorstep interview that ended 45 years of lying in less than a day. Drop it in the comments, because this community is what keeps cold cases like Colleen's alive in people's minds long after the news cycle moves on. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover a new solved cold case every week. Always fact-checked against original reporting, not just recycled headlines. And if you know someone who's obsessed with true crime the way you are, send them this video. Cases like Colleen's only stay solved in the public memory if people keep telling them right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.